July 18, 2021. Some time ago, I used to do charcoal sketches of various beings I came in contact with. I have a book full of papers from different times. Before I found this place, I was amazed by the various entities that live in this universe. This was a sketch of two beings I came in contact with. Hashtag sketch. Hashtag happy, hashtag reminiscing. Hashtag good old days, hashtag instagood. Hashtag photo. The first human contact I've made was a real sweet person. At first, he made a mistake on the date due to his anxiety over his girlfriend who left him, his downfall. I like to trace over it with charcoal every day. It makes me feel like I'm closer to him again. He is dearly missed, but you know what they say, it had to be you. Hashtag letter. Hashtag old letter. Hashtag happy. Hashtag miss my friend. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag photo. Hashtag love. July 20th, 2021. Beautiful sundown last night. Photo taken by a friend. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photography. Hashtag happy. Hashtag love. Hashtag excited. Hashtag love you. Hashtag I love you all. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. July 23, 2021. I like to blend in with mall mannequins. It is fitting, as I've taken the form of a soon-to-be mannequin head, but I've learned it worked in my favor, because I can just stand in shopping malls and observe how much the average customer spends on items they don't need, or because their children will not stop shrieking until they get what they want. Noted. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag hunger. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photo shoot. He begged me to grant him a girlfriend. I told him if he stops being a creep and is respectful, maybe he will get one. I hate how demanding your species are. They demand and demand, yet give nothing in return, just like Richard. Hashtag creepy. Hashtag creep. Hashtag gross. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photo. Hashtag text. Hashtag stop. July 24, 2021. Hello all. My species said that they want more to study. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag how are you? Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag hungry. July 27, 2021. Almost there. Did you know that my species can enter your dreams? Sometimes they will be nice to you, and other times they will not. Don't be scared though, they can't actually hurt you in the dreams, but they sure do make them feel real. Hashtag meeting. Hashtag a hashtag new. Hashtag friend. Hashtag excited. Hashtag can't wait. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag Instagram. August 10, 2021. It has been some time. I missed you all. I needed to find some new friends to take home. They were sad to say goodbye to this rock, but I comforted them. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag happy to be back. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. September 14, 2021. Hello, everyone. I have some wonderful news. My family wants to visit. They promise to be quiet and blend in. Now that they have references of what you all look like, that should be easy. They promised me that they wouldn't be mean to you all. So please, do not worry if you notice a being that seems slightly off. They are just as nervous to see you. As for me, I'm happy with how I look, and I don't want to change. Hashtag friends. Hashtag hello. Hashtag happy. Hashtag love. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag I love you all. December 5, 2021. I tried to have one of my family members take a photo of me turning into my true form, but sadly, this was the only thing it captured. Polaroids captured it better. Digital cameras get all messed up. My face sort of changed, but not enough. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag I love you. Hashtag love. Hashtag reborn. Hashtag rebirth. Hashtag I missed you. July 23, 2022. I've missed you all so much. Many things have happened since we last talked. I was in a situation that needed my full attention. But I am back again. Hashtag hello. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag I'm back. Hashtag I missed you. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photography. July 24, 2022. The feeling of being back on this planet is one I have truly missed. A sense of euphoria. I went home with 2 new friends from here. They were nervous at first, like all the rest, but once they arrived, they entered a sort of state that made them speechless. My people learned so much more about the human emotional response. It gives us the opportunity to visit you more and not feel out of place. I was going to stay home, my family wanted it, but truth be told, I feel like this place is my second home, and when I came back, the sweet smell of smog was a nostalgia rush that one who is addicted to a drug could only describe. My new roommate, he doesn't know I'm living here yet, seems really cool. We'll update you all with info soon. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag love. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photos. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag love you. Hashtag nostalgia. July 26, 2022. Some don't know this about me, but I can shorten my hair without cutting it. All I have to do is pull the fibers back into the body. This is my favorite hairstyle. It makes me feel like you. Hashtag hello. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photos. Hashtag photography. Hashtag love you. Hashtag I love you all. Hashtag fun facts. Hashtag hairstyles. Hashtag hair. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. July 27, 2022. I tried to take a picture of my real form, but the camera wouldn't pick up on it. Sorry. Here's a regular photo next to it. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photos. Hashtag photography. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag for you. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag I love you. Hashtag smile. Hashtag excited. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag makeup. July 28, 2022. Molting has finished. This is what I look like without makeup. The first molt I documented on May 4th of 2021 was me after I added makeup. I feel comfortable enough to show you all what I look like without filters. You all are beautiful, just the way you are too. Remember that. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photography. Hashtag no makeup. Hashtag love. Hashtag molting. Hashtag molt. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag excited. Hashtag smile. July 29, 2022. My roommate's landlord heard sounds of a screaming cat, but it was just me. He got very agitated. So, I removed his doorknob and will be paying him a visit tonight to show him how I make those sounds. Hashtag hello. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag TYP. Hashtag excited. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag Sabrina. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photos. Hashtag photography. Hashtag doorknob. Hashtag landlord. August 2nd, 2022, someone messaged me. They asked me to show my tits. I showed him. But they were inside out. His response, the fuck? Why do people type phrases like this? Is it fear and not being able to type the correct spelling? Noted. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instamood. Hashtag FYP. Hashtag happy. Hashtag excited. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag hungry. August 8, 2022. Old news clip of me on the television set. Whoever sketched me like this did me dirty. Hashtag hello. Hashtag happy. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag instamood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag news. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag photo of the day. Hashtag photo. Hashtag photographer. Hashtag photos. Hashtag photography. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag drawing. Hashtag draw. Hashtag sketch. August 16, 2022. They aren't cold. None of them get cold. They inevitably became room temperature. A fact that I was horribly mistaken on. I always thought they became cold. Still so much to learn. Hashtag fun facts. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag instamood. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instalove. Hashtag temp. Hashtag happy. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag smile. Hashtag teeth. Hashtag eyes. Hashtag lips. Hashtag torso. Hashtag calf. August 18, 2022. I couldn't control my hunger last night. They didn't deserve what happened to them. Why do you have to taste so good? My species eats organic matter, and that typically was organisms that had no physical form, but this just tastes so much better. Being at home for the length of time I forgot how to control my emotions again. But I'm trying. Hashtag taste. Hashtag tasty. Hashtag hunger. Hashtag hungry. Hashtag yummy. Hashtag hello. Hashtag hi. Hashtag instagood. Hashtag instalove. Hashtag Instagram. Hashtag instadaily. Hashtag for you. Hashtag TYP. Hashtag love. Hashtag love you. Hashtag pretty. Hashtag beautiful. Hashtag smile.